3 months ago, who would have ever thought that it would be possible to pull off a virtual vacation Bible school? I never thought that. I imagine a lot of you never even dreamed of that. But fortunately, Eric and Mandy said, sure, we can do that. And they put together a fantastic series for not only the children, but also the adults as well. And they did it with a lot of help. Karen Lowe and Amber Queen and Melinda Shar and Mandy put the craft packages together, which made my little visual aids I use in my kids' classes pretty paltry by comparison. Lori Vayon did an amazing job with the craft how-to sessions. Ed did a wonderful job telling the Bible stories in a way that could relate to the kids. And then Don Truex did just such an amazing job. I couldn't help but notice that several of you made comments about his voice. So I've been taking voice lessons. But until I go through puberty, it's not going to help very much. But he did a great job. And I will tell you, as a preacher, you like it when a church says, here are the specific things we want you to preach about, because you know that you can be intentional. But it is a lot of work to put together 4 tailor-made lessons for a theme. And he did just a masterful job. I thought it was the perfect content and tone for a time frame like we've been in as a culture here lately. And of course, Kyle Jackson and Jackson Sneed for doing the great job. All the work that had to be done on the back end to record the videos, get all the different shoots right, and then of course, posting everything online. So thank you all for all that you did to make a great experience and how great it has been. I think one of the great blessings of this unusual time we've been in is that it has really helped parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles to take a more hands-on approach in teaching their children. And I know you guys had a great time just from seeing all of the pictures that were posted. So great to have you all here to be able to tell in person and to everybody the great work that you did. We also, of course, want to keep in mind all of our dear brothers and sisters who are watching us online as they are continuing to be very cautious because of underlying health issues or because they are in regular contact with those who are at high risk. And we want you to know we love you and we miss you and we appreciate you and glad that you're able to be with us in this format that we have. Well, the theme of VBS was Jesus, the living water. And a lot of us who preach, when we have to sit back and watch other people teach and preach for an extended period of time, we want to get in there and start teaching and preaching as well. So I started thinking, what other stories are there in the New Testament that connect Jesus with water? And the only other story I could really think of is a story found in John chapter 4, the story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman. And I thought that in view of recent events in our country, there could not be a better passage for us to think through together today than this story here in John chapter 4. Now, as Joel did the reading for us today, you saw that the background of this story is that Jesus is shifting from teaching and preaching down in the south in Judea to go north to Galilee. But to do so, verse 4 says in John 4 that he had to pass through Samaria. That may seem like a simple geographical detail because to get from Judea to Galilee, the straightest path is to go right through Samaria. But you all are well aware of the history that existed between the Jews and the Samaritans. You are well acquainted with the background of where the Samaritans came from, the interracial mixture of the Israelites from the northern tribes and the Assyrian conquerors and the captive peoples that they brought into the land. And you know that not only were there racial hostilities between the Jews and Samaritans, you know that there were significant religious differences, that the Samaritans only accepted the first 5 books of the law. And since none of those books mention Jerusalem or Mount Zion as a place of worship, they worshiped at the one spot that is connected with blessing in the law, which is Mount Gerizim, the mount on which the people read the blessings of the law when they came in to the promised land. And you also know that these racial and religious differences were also inflamed to the point that there was violence between the two communities. You may recall from our study of Nehemiah that it was Sanballat, a Samaritan, who was one of the instigators of the violence or the threat of violence against Nehemiah as they rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. In the period between the end of the Old Testament and beginning of the New, hostilities became so intense that the Jews actually destroyed the Samaritan temple that had been built on Mount Gerizim, although after that, Samaritans, even to this day, still continue to go up to Mount Gerizim and worship at the remains of that temple. So given this long history of seething hatred, it is remarkable that in verse 4, John says that Jesus had to pass through Samaria. Sometimes Jews would bypass Samaria altogether. Other times when they ventured into Samaria, they put their lives at risk. And yet there's something important going on in the use of this word had. If we were reading John in Greek, we would see exactly the same word in two other places. We would see it back in John chapter 3 and in verse 14, where the text says, "And as Moses lifted up the servant in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up." That's the same word. Jesus had to be lifted up. In other words, he must be lifted up to die on the cross. And then it's also used in John 3 and verse 30 when, with regard to John the Baptist, we learn that Jesus must increase and John must decrease. This is the word that refers to the mission of God. The mission of God that leads Jesus to the cross. The mission of God that will exalt Jesus above John the Baptist. And the mission of God that will lead Jesus to go into this region of the despised Samaritans. So if we want to know how to carry out the mission of God in a divided world, this is as good a place as any to look to for guidance. And here's the first thing that I want you to see in this text that will help us carry out the mission of God in a divided world. Show kindness to those who are different. Let's read verse 5. "So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there." Jacob's well is still there. At least I went to a building that said Jacob's well, and this guy in there drew out water and put a little jug and had a stamp that says Jacob's well. So it has to be legit, right? So how many ever millions of dollars I paid for this surely was money well spent. Well, it actually probably is the location because there aren't that many wells in that part of the world that could have sustained life from the time of Jacob till the time of Jesus. It says that Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour, high noon. Now, I went there as a tourist. Jesus has gone there because he's tired, and as we're about to learn, he's hungry and thirsty. Verse 7, "A woman from Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, 'Give me a drink.' For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food." So now we know why Jesus is at the well. He's a man, yes, and he's thirsty, yes, but he's also on a mission. And you may remember that as he's completing his mission in John's gospel, one of the things Jesus says is, "I thirst." And now, as he's about the mission of God, he says, "Give me a drink." Now, remember, this is the Son of God who performed miracles you studied this week. Stilling storms, walking on water, feeding thousands. If Jesus had been interested in using his own power for his own self-interest, did he really need to ask for a drink? I think had he wanted to, he could have easily provided water on his own. So I want you to see that the way Jesus begins here, to interact with someone whose race had centuries of animosity with his race was not by preaching to her. It was by engaging her with courtesy to ask for a favor. Jesus often used eating and drinking as a way to reach out to those who had been left out in his culture. And it is truly amazing how something this simple can break down barriers. A couple of years ago, I flew into Nashville early one morning to speak at a summer series. And I got there, it was a pretty early flight. I had to skip breakfast to make the flight. And so I was kind of hungry when I landed, and it just so happens that just around the corner from where the airport is, there is a restaurant called Monell's. Monell's at the Manor. Monell's, some of you remember Branch Ranch? Monell's is like that, only I have to say, 1,000,000 times better. And when you go in, there are these big dining room tables like your granny had at her house. And you go in and you sit down, and whoever else comes in will sit at that table until that table's full, and then they'll fill up another table, and then they start bringing it out. Platter after platter after platter. So this was breakfast. So fried chicken, which is a hillbilly delicacy for breakfast, and bacon and sausage, and a big old bowl of eggs, and fried apples, and grits, and gravy, and biscuits, and peach preserves, and revival will break out when you go to eat at Monell's. So I was hungry. I went in, and it was kind of the end of the breakfast rush. So I went and I sat down, and I was at this big table all by myself. And then here comes a large family, all African Americans. And of course, they're going to be seated because they fill up the tables. They all sit with me. So, it's awkward anytime you're just sitting there with total strangers. So I tried to break the ice and said, hey, I've been waiting for you guys. You're late. So we came, and then we started eating, and then one of the ladies said grace. And I thought, okay, we're going to be able to speak the same language. We all believe. So we started talking. And I never like to tell people I'm a preacher because people have such misconceptions about preachers, but they kept asking me, so do you live here? No, I used to. Well, why are you here in town? Well, for work. What do you do? So finally, they peeled the layers away. I had to just confess, well, I'm a preacher. So then they started asking me Bible questions. Hey, preacher. And then they would just start asking me, and it was kind of fun. We were having a good time. And then the oldest of all of them, the oldest black gentleman, said, preacher, it seems like race relations are getting worse rather than better. Why do you think that is? I mean, it's me all alone. And I thought, he's comfortable enough to bring up a very tricky subject. So I said, well, sir, first of all, you've experienced things I'll never experience. A few years before I was born, he would not have been permitted to be in that restaurant. We couldn't have been sitting at the same table to eat. And then I said, although I know you've experienced things I never will, here are my ideas. And we began to talk about it. It was a good conversation. At the end of it, his daughter insisted that we take a picture together. I meant to put it into the slideshow. Christy was horrified because I was wearing my Rowdy Roddy Piper wrestling shirt when I took this picture, and she was just humiliated by her idiot husband being a wrestling fan in public like that. The point I want you all to see is that whole exchange, which was beautiful, took place because we were sitting and eating and drinking together. That's how Jesus breaks the ice with this woman to intentionally cross a social barrier by asking her for a favor. And she noticed, look at verse 9. The Samaritan woman said to him, how is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? And then John explains, for Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. By his clothing and his speech, Jesus was obviously Jewish. She noticed that. And so she wants to know, why are you talking to me? I mean, we know from rabbinical writings that the Jews typically viewed all Samaritan women as perpetually unclean. In fact, later in John chapter 8, when the Jewish leaders really want to insult Jesus, they say two things: you have a demon and you're a Samaritan. So she can't understand why this Jewish man all of a sudden wants to talk to her. I don't know exactly the tone of her voice, but honestly, does it appear like she's super friendly at this point? And you know what? When you try to carry out the mission of God in a divided world, you have to expect that some people who have faced centuries of bitter relations with people who look like you may not trust you at first. But Jesus doesn't get defensive. He just doubles down on the kindness. Verse 10, if you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, give me a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water. You know, some of you grew up drinking well water. Maybe some of you still do. Where my people are from in eastern Kentucky, we had one down in our holler, and it tastes good, and it's so crisp and clear and fresh. But you got to think, if you lived in the ancient world and you had to choose between a stagnant cistern and fresh living water from a flowing stream, which one would you choose? Jesus is trying to convey to her, I can give you something much better than you can imagine. Verse 11, the woman said to him, sir, you have nothing to draw water with, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? She probably had a bucket, and it's going to be attached to a rope. That well is about 100 foot down into the ground. Jesus doesn't have anything to draw with. How's he going to find living water? As far as she's concerned, Jacob's well is all she needs. Verse 12, are you greater than our father Jacob? He gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock. Jacob found such a great watering hole that it's been used for centuries. You think you're better than him? Now, of course, we know the answer. Yes. Because Jesus can do something better than give her H2O. And this brings up a second lesson. And that is, having opened the door of the mission of God by showing kindness, now Jesus can focus on the need for God's grace. Verse 13, Jesus said to her, everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give to him will never be thirsty again. The water that I give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life. Jesus wants her to know about the gift of God, the grace of God that will sustain her spiritually like living water could physically. Jesus is alluding to things that God promised all through the Old Testament, like this passage in Isaiah 44. I will pour out water on the thirsty land and streams on the dry ground. I will pour my spirit upon your offspring and my blessings on your descendants. But all she can think of is how great it would be not to have to trudge out in the middle of the day and do the hard work of carrying water. Verse 15, the woman said to him, sir, give me this water so that I too will not be thirsty or have to come here to draw water. Now, she doesn't get what Jesus is offering because she doesn't understand what she needs. She needs grace because her life is a mess. And so Jesus, a complete stranger, is about to reveal all of the skeletons in her closet. Jesus said to her, verse 16, go, call your husband and come here. The woman answered, I have no husband. Jesus said, you're right about that. You've had 5 husbands. The one you have now isn't your husband. What you've said is true. By the way, this may explain why she's coming out to draw at noon, an unusual hour to draw water. Typically in the ancient world, they would do it in the cool of the day. Maybe she's having to do it at noon, as commentators have suggested, because she's a pariah in her own town. She's a reject among rejects, as the Jews would look at things. She needs grace. Now, when I say focus on grace, I'm not saying that we should ignore injustices like racism. You guys know that I have preached on that subject a lot. Quite honestly, I've preached on it so much. I'm afraid that people who aren't a part of this church, if they peruse our website, are going to think, what is the deal with these people at Valrico? Why does this preacher talk about this so much? But it's not because I think we have a problem here. It's because there's such a problem out there that my job as a preacher and our job as a church is to bear testimony to the Word of God against all sin, including the sin of racism. But once we've done that, we also need to offer people the solution, which is the grace of God. Yesterday, I went down to visit with our good brother Willie and Miss Verdi, and his spirits are so good in spite of the pain he's in. He sees the doctor Thursday to figure out what the next step will be, whether he's going to have surgery. But as you can imagine, recent events came up in our conversation, and as soon as it did, the first words out of Willie's mouth were this: this problem boils down to sin. That's exactly right. And the solution to sin is God's transforming grace. Now, if you just met someone for the very first time and they suddenly told you your deepest, darkest secrets, what would you think? Verse 19, the woman said, "Sir, I perceive that you're a prophet." Well, no duh, right? I mean, yeah, this isn't normal. And so it's like she's thinking, okay, this guy's the real deal. I got a question. Maybe he can answer it. Verse 20, our fathers worshipped on this mountain, Mount Gerizim. But you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship. Here's a third key that this question leads us to see how to do the mission of God in a divided world. Demonstrate the way of God. Practice what you preach by the way you treat others, especially as it concerns living by God's new standard in the Spirit and by truth. Verse 21, Jesus said to her, woman, and remember that vernacular means something along the lines of madam or ma'am in our culture. Believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem you will worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. In other words, madam, on this question, your fathers got it wrong, and they've had it wrong for centuries. Jerusalem is the place where God placed his name. And you know what this tells us, by the way? It is no excuse to say, well, this was how I was raised. It's what my parents told me. That's never an excuse for anything, whether it's the problems of the Samaritan understanding of Scripture or the problems of race relations. And anyone who justifies what they do on the basis of how they were raised is not going to get a pass from Jesus. But notice, Jesus doesn't leave this at, you Samaritans made some really big mistakes, and the Jews are right, the end. Because this isn't the end. God has something new in mind. When neither Mount Gerizim nor Mount Zion were going to be relevant. Verse 23, but the hour is coming and is now here when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. And this is one of those times I think our translations should translate spirit with a capital S, like the New International Version does. Remember that passage from Isaiah? What is the outpouring of water on a dry and thirsty land describing? I will pour my spirit upon your offspring and my blessings on your descendants. The prophets looked forward to the day when God's spirit would be poured out in the new and glorious era of the Messiah. Jesus says, that is exactly what I have come to accomplish. And because of that, geography and genealogy are both irrelevant. All that matters is, are you the kind of person that is seeking to worship God in spirit, in the new and living way the Spirit has given, and in the truth of God? And what that means then is, the new way of the Spirit means that the old way of the flesh is no longer important, that Jews and Samaritans, anyone who desires to worship God can do so wherever they live, just like Jesus transformed the water to wine design. He's saying that God's plan is now being transformed from something good, what we had in the old covenant, to something much better. The prerequisite of worship will no longer be race or real estate. It will be the grace of the living water of the Spirit. But the point I'm getting at here is, Jesus didn't just believe this. He didn't just teach this. He is at this very moment demonstrating this. By engaging this Samaritan woman, even though he was obviously Jewish, he was showing in his very actions and demonstrating that spiritual identity is no longer defined in the old way of doing things. And you and I can bear testimony to the world by demonstrating our love of God in the Spirit and by truth across race and class and ethnicity. We do that in our church already. It's going to happen more and more. When I preached up in Elgin, Illinois, the city of Elgin was incredibly diverse. Essentially, the entire eastern side of the city was predominantly Hispanic. In addition to that, from some of the other communities that we fed off of, we had many African American members, and it never ceased to impress my friends, like say my barbershop friends, who I would invite, and they would come and they would visit. It was the first thing they noticed. I can't believe how diverse this church is. We were trying to demonstrate by our very community as a church the truth that Jesus is teaching. Now, because Jesus has shown kindness, he's focused on God's grace, and he has actually practiced what he preaches. Look at how her conversation changes from how to get out of manual labor to knowing who the Messiah is. Verse 25, the woman said to him, I know the Messiah is coming, he who's called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things. The Samaritans believed in a Messiah figure. Based on Deuteronomy 18, they called him the teacher. He will tell us all things. And in response to her hope, for one of only a handful of times in all four Gospels, Jesus directly identifies himself to someone. Verse 26, I who speak to you am he. You just think, what's just happened to this woman? In a matter of minutes, this outcast of a denigrated people, dealing with tedious, mindless chores, has just come face to face with the hope of centuries of expectation. And he made sure she knew who he was. Now, right now, I want to use an illustration so bad because last night Willie told me the story of his conversion, and it preaches good, but I told him I think he should preach it someday. So I'm not going to steal his thunder. I'll just tell you this. This is sort of a little preview, right? A little sampler, a little appetizer. His conversion was every bit as unexpected as this woman's encounter with Christ was. Now, here's the thing. This story is just now getting exciting, and guess who stumbles back? Verse 27, just then his disciples came back. It's almost like they're going to ruin everything, but they don't. Because we're going to see three responses to what Jesus is doing here. The first is the response of the Samaritan woman. It says they marveled that he was talking with the woman, but no one said, what do you seek, or why are you talking with her? The woman left, but now listen, they haven't bungled this encounter. Look at the little detail at the next part of verse 28. What does she leave behind? Her water jar. Now, I'll tell you, preachers, they can wax eloquent on the significance of that. And you know what? It may just be she forgot. It may also be she's ready to choose a new way in life. What may be the most probable explanation is she's just really excited and she's eager to go tell others about what she's experienced. Verse 28 goes on to say she went away into town and said to the people, come see a man who told me all I ever did. Can this be the Christ? They went out to the town and were coming to him. So here's the thing. If we are kind to people and focus on God's grace and really practice what we preach, we're going to be amazed at the people who become interested in the gospel. But that's not the universal reaction here. Verse 31, meanwhile the disciples were urging him, saying, Rabbi, eat. Apparently Jesus had forgotten to eat. Any of y'all ever forget, you get so busy, you forget to eat? Yeah, I don't understand you people, all right? But apparently Jesus did. But he says to them, I have food to eat that you do not know about. So the disciples said to one another, has anyone brought him something to eat? Here's the second reaction. The disciples are confused by what's going on. They are every bit as confused as the Samaritan woman who, upon hearing Jesus talk about living water, thinks he's talking about a new source of a water supply. And they think as soon as they hear Jesus talk about food that he's talking about something to actually grub on. And I'll tell you this, if you carry out consciously the mission of God to all people, there are going to be some people for whom that is not comfortable and they don't get it and they don't understand. Why do you have to go do that and talk to those people? Because they are stuck in the old way of the flesh rather than living in God's new way of the Spirit, and they need teaching just like the disciples. So Jesus explained what this food is. Verse 34. Jesus said to them, my food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. Jesus wants the disciples to know what their mission is. It's the mission of God that they're on, especially when there's so much to do. Verse 35 says, do you not say there are yet 4 months, and then comes harvest? You plant in the spring, 4 months later, in the fall you harvest. Look, I tell you, lift up your eyes and see the fields are white for harvest right now. When Jesus says the fields are white for harvest, some commentators have suggested he's talking about the Samaritans. Do you remember what it said? Back in verse 30, they were coming out of town to see him. So in real time, as these Samaritans are walking out to see Jesus, Jesus says the fields are white to harvest. And the Samaritans, at least today, and they still meet, today there's about 800 of them, they traditionally dress in white. Some people think that what Jesus is talking about, look, the fields, they're literally white for harvest. Look at all the Samaritans coming to us. I don't know if that's true or not. It preaches pretty good though, so that's what we're going to go with here. Today, maybe Jesus is saying, look, you don't have to wonder what your mission is. It's walking to you. Just open your eyes. Well, the harvest is indeed ready. Look at verse 39. Many Samaritans from that town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me all that I ever did. And that leads to a third reaction. The Samaritans want to hang out with Christ. Verse 40. So when the Samaritans came to him, they asked him to stay with them. And he stayed there 2 days. I preached on this text a little while ago, a couple years ago, when I was preaching through the Gospel of John. Completely glossed over this verse, and it didn't register with me. I think maybe it's taken the events that I've seen on TV over the last couple of weeks to really drive home the significance of what John was saying. Do you get it? What did verse 9 say? The Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Do you see that in a matter of hours, we've gone from Jews have no dealings with Samaritans to Samaritans urging, the New King James says, begging, the New Living Translation says, a Jew to stay with them. Now you talk about transforming a social situation in a matter of hours. You see what happens when you show people kindness when they're not expecting it, and you focus on the grace of God, and you actually practice what you claim to believe and preach. If we are faithful to the mission of God in a divided world, just maybe the world won't be so divided. This has been a tough few months. It's been a tough last couple of weeks. To see the pain in the black and biracial members of my family after what's been going on. To see so much violence that's hurting poor minority and white communities. It's just been tough. And so many of you were so kind last week after my sermon, but if it seemed last week in particular like I was a little bit aggressive, you just have to know that when you determine that when you preach, you just want to lay your heart out, sometimes things start coming out of it you don't even expect, and it happens. So just pray for me. And then on top of everything else that's happened, we got news that Clint was about to pass away. He was put in hospice. So John and I texted and said, let's try to get over there. So Friday afternoon, I made my way over to Temple Terrace to go to the hospice. And as I got out of the car and I turned the corner, I could see Clint's sister, Maria, standing at a window because there were limits on how many people could go into the room, and only 2 at a time could go in, and she was standing there. And I came around the corner, literally, as she saw her brother die. And she turned to me and she said, my brother's dead. And then I saw her other sister I was very good friends with at school, Melanie. And then her mom and dad, Joe and Jane. Just a lot of stuff hitting y'all at the same time when things like this happen. And I sat there and I talked with Melanie for a long time, catching up. And then I happened to notice, John and I both noticed, there were a lot of younger people coming and they had T-Mobile shirts on. They knew Clint from work. But the remarkable thing was, I actually almost took a picture, but I just thought it would be inappropriate in the circumstance. The remarkable thing was how incredibly diverse all of his coworkers were. Every shade of every race you could possibly imagine. And of course, it was a tribute to the kind of sweet and loving person Clint was that all of these people have come to pay their respects to him and to his family. But you just have to see it from my point of view to be sitting there on a bench and watching this all take place, but having those scenes in my mind of what's been on the news, the juxtaposition of those two scenes was absolutely jarring. And as I was about to leave, I felt like I had to say something. So I went over to the semicircle where they were all standing around. They were talking to Clint's dad, Joe, at that point. And I just engaged a little bit of conversation about, they knew Clint from work. And I said, well, just thank you all so much for coming to give support and comfort to his family. And then, just like sermons lately, things just start bubbling out. And I said to them, with everything going on, to see you all here and all of this love, it just gives me hope. And listen, I'm not for a second naive enough to think that all we've got to go do is quote a verse to people, and just like that, all these problems go away. Nothing I say today is to be taken as any kind of refusal to acknowledge whatever political or systemic changes they need to make. I'm well aware of that. Here's all I know. What I saw that day at that moment, to me, is what is most real. And as I turned to walk away, one of the black girls who was there just said, "God bless you." If we're going to ever work through these things, it's only going to be because God blesses us. And I have hope that he can, because of what I just read about a change that took place in the hearts of people in a little town called Sychar. So this morning, if you are someone in need of God's grace, and that is every one of us, whether as someone who needs to become a Christian, we would love to show you more, to teach and try to guide you more to know the living water that Jesus Christ can give. And as a child of God, to have the grace to be kind, to have the grace to show grace, to have the grace to be consistent in how you live. And if we can help you in any way, let us know while we stand and sing together.